Good afternoon. We are starting the April 9th meeting of the Finance Committee. All committee members are present.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Malcolm Hamilton, Administrative Analyst in the Water Resources Division. I'm here today with HDR, Sean Korn, our analyst from HDR, to present the proposed wastewater rates for fiscal years 2020, 2021, and 2022. Before I turn it over to Sean to go into the real in-depth details, I'd like to just take a step back and look at the wastewater system as a whole. What we're talking about is a system that plays a leading role in the protection of public health and the environment within our city. And when we talk about the system assets, we're looking at the sewer mains and the collection system, lift stations, our access structures, which is manholes and cleanouts, and of course, the El Estero wastewater treatment plant. And what we need to keep the system going is a continued investment in these capital needs in support of that goal as a leading asset in public health and the environment. We're looking at about $30 million in PAYGO capital in the next 6 years. In addition to that, we recently completed the El Estero Facilities Master Plan. It identified $95 million in capital needs over the next 25 years. Just to highlight a couple within the next 10, the electrical renewal project and the solids handling. So we're currently underway with the renewal project, and the solids handling will be starting in about 2027. But together they combine for another about $30 million that we'll need to invest within the next 10 years.
What is solids handling?
I'd like to invite up Joshua Hagmark, our Water Resources Manager.
Joshua Hagmark, Water Resources Manager. Mr. Chair, the solids handling, so all the solids that come out of our treatment process ultimately end up, and we right now handle and send those up to Santa Maria to be composted. And so it's equivalent to about a truckload a day, large semi-truck that leaves and heads up to Santa Maria. And so our process of handling those solids right now, they're pretty wet. And so going through, and if we can get those, reduce the amount of liquid in there, we can cut down on the truck trips. And we're also obviously still looking at other ideas to compost that material locally, because that does have a lot of value to our local farmers and certainly our parks and stuff. Mm-hmm.
So taking a quick look at what we've done prior to getting here at Finance Committee today, we started early in June where the Water Commission appointed a 2-member ad hoc committee to discuss different policy issues as they came up through the rate development process. We met with them a few times, really starting on October 18th. We did Wastewater Rates 101, which is an overview of the rate setting process. We can bring everybody up to speed, especially some of the new Water Commission members. In December, we presented our various policy issues that we thought were the salient points that needed to be discussed. Coming back in February, we got a final policy recommendation on our residential customer class from Water Commission. And most recently, on March 28th, we went to the Water Commission with a very similar presentation to this one. Now, they did vote 3-0 to recommend that the Finance Committee approve the noticing to send out to customers, but they also requested that staff return after the final report is available, and they'd like to have a further discussion on our high-strength discharges. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Korn, and he'll be stepping you through the remaining portion of the presentation.
Thank you, Malcolm. Good afternoon. Appreciate the opportunity. I'll talk real briefly about the overview of the rate setting process, and then we'll get into the results of the comprehensive sewer rate study, and then we'll talk next steps as we go through this and essentially outline the approach that we've taken to establish the rates and develop the recommendations that we have. So starting off, we had an overall goal and objective for the study, and it's really making sure that we maintain the long-term financial sustainability of the wastewater utility. It's an enterprise fund. Essentially, that means that the revenues received for that fund pay for all the costs of that fund. And so that is primarily received through sewer rates. and that's the vast majority. 98% of the revenues that come into this are the revenues that support this. And so we want to make sure that as we look at operating and capital needs, we're able to fund those over the long term as part of this. Another key aspect is meeting the proportionality requirements of Proposition 218. So we need to come back and develop cost-based and equitable rates that reflect the characteristics of each of the different customer classes. And you can assume the rate structure or rate schedule is equivalent to a customer class. So we have our residential rate schedule, our non-residential rate schedule, et cetera, that we're looking at. Those are those customer classes that we allocate costs to. And as I mentioned, maintaining the long-term financial sustainability, we want to make sure that we operate and maintain the facility. So we have certain criteria that we want to meet, and some of that is making sure that we maintain an adequate debt service coverage ratio. So as Malcolm talked about, all those additional projects that are needed, some of those will be long-term borrowing, and as a result, we may need to make sure that our credit rating for the utility is good, and that helps with lower interest costs and making sure that we're able to fund those capital projects as well as maintain reserve requirements. So we have a city council policy on the amount of reserves we maintain. We're maintaining that during this time period that we're looking at, but that is also a key element. And then we base the study on generally accepted methodologies. And there's a Water Environment Federation Manual Practice number 27. It outlines the approach to establishing cost-based rates. But we need to tailor that to the city's characteristics. We need to look at the city's costs, the city's customer classes or rate schedules, and determine how we're going to equitably allocate those costs. And when we do that and you look at those industry standard approaches, it outlines a three-step process. And it takes a look at a revenue requirement, cost of service, and rate design. And these are sequential processes that you go through. The revenue requirement looks at what is the overall level of revenue necessary to prudently maintain the utility. So this is looking at the operating, O&M expenses, as well as the capital funding component. And really what that gives us is the size of the pie, right? That tells us how much revenue we need in any given year. And we look at this over a multi-year period. Once we know that, then we need to determine how do we proportionally allocate that to each customer class? What is the benefit or the cost incurred to provide service to each class? And that's done through a cost of service. That essentially gives a piece of the pie to each of the different customer classes. And that generates the revenue we need to collect from each class to reflect the proportional and equitable allocation of costs. That rolls right into the rate design, so that looks at how you charge your customers. And really what this does is we take the unit costs out of the cost of service, so dollars per customer or dollars per water consumption in this case, and develop a rate to collect that amount of revenue that we've allocated through the cost of service study. So that's the process that we've gone through. We have a recommendation at each of these three components: the overall revenue adjustment for the revenue requirement, the allocation of cost to the different customer classes and what that looks like, and then the rates, proposed rates for the next 5 years. That would be the maximum notice through a Prop 218 process. So on the revenue requirement, as we've talked about, it's a comparison of the current revenues and the expenses necessary to maintain the overall utility in a financially sustainable manner. We want to make sure, as I've mentioned, that we are maintaining our renewal and replacement. Malcolm talked about the pay-go projects. That's that renewal and replacement funding that we should be funding on an annual basis through rates, maintaining our reserves, our debt service coverage ratio to make sure that we are looking long-term for the utility. You look at a specific time period. In this case, we're looking at a 3-year period to establish rates, but we also look out in the technical analysis over a longer time period to make sure there's nothing coming up around the corner that we need to plan for today. So we want to make sure if there's major improvements in year 7, that we're able to look at that today to see what is that going to do to rates. Do we need to adjust rates today to meet that, or can we move forward with what we're looking at over the short term? As I mentioned, we analyze this on a standalone basis. It is an enterprise fund, so only the sewer rate revenues and minor miscellaneous revenues should be funding the overall cost of maintaining the utility. And we use what's called the cash basis approach, and really that's just a year-by-year look. For all the accountants, it's not truly the accounting version of the cash basis. It's just looking at each year what those costs are, what do revenues need to be at to fund the overall costs in that year. So the summary of the revenue requirement, Under the cash basis approach, we have 4 components. We have our O&M expenses, our rate-funded capital, our debt service, and our reserve funding. And so we started with fiscal year 2019 budget, and then we project into the future. So the first blue bars here on the screen, you can see how I'll walk through each part, is showing what the projection of O&M expenses are over the 5-year period, fiscal year 2020 through 2024. And the focus is really on fiscal 2020 through 2022. That's the rate setting period that we're reviewing. You can see that increases over time based on historical inflationary costs for the city. So we've projected that forward as part of our analysis. The black is the rate-funded capital. So this is the pay-go component of the rate. So each year we have a portion of rate revenues that is put back into the system. And we want to make sure that that's adequate to maintain and improve current service levels. Once we have that, we then add our net debt service. And so this is the annual debt service. This is principal and interest payments. And what you can see is that when you get out to 2020 to 2021, there's a jump, and then that increases each year over the time period. That is the current amortization schedule or the debt schedule for the electrical distribution project. So that's being phased in, and actually in fiscal year 2025, the full principal and interest will be included in that year. So once that project is complete, then that amortization schedule will be established. We also are able at times to put money into reserves. Sometimes these funds go into our capital reserve to be used to fund projects. Other times it's to meet our minimum target reserve. So you can see there's 4 years here, a little bit in the current budget, and then a little in 2020, and then in the last 2 years where we're able to put revenues into reserves. Now, comparing that to our current revenues, that's the dashed horizontal line. So if we make no adjustment to rates, then you can see that when we get out into 2020 and out, then our expenses exceed our revenues. And so when we get out to the 5th year, you can see essentially we're only funding O&M and rate-funded capital. We're not able to fund annual debt service payments. So to meet that, we would need to adjust revenues to meet the overall funding needs of the utility. So what our conclusions and recommendations based on that is that revenue increases are necessary to prudently fund the overall operating and capital needs of the wastewater utility. So that takes into consideration all the necessary annual capital improvements over the next 3 to 5 year period, the additional annual debt service payments, both principal and interest, as well as inflationary increases in O&M costs. So to meet that top line of proposed revenue, it is an annual adjustment of 5% over all revenues. Now, this is just the size of the pie. So this shows that the pie needs to be 5% bigger annually over the next 3 years. This does not mean that the actual customer impact will be 5% because we haven't gone through the cost of service or designed rates, and that can result in different impacts for different customers. We're looking at a 3-year transition plan, so fiscal year 2020 through fiscal year 2022 as part of that, and this maintains the financially healthy and sustainable utility for the long term. So now that we know the size of the pie, then we're able to split that pie up, and so that's done through our cost of service, and really it is why. What is it? Well, it's an analysis to equitably and proportionally allocate costs based on how the city incurs costs. So that could be for collection or for treatment, are the primary 2 components of a wastewater utility. And really we need to do this because no utility tracks costs by residential customers. Today we're treating residential wastewater. Tomorrow we treat commercial wastewater. It all comes through the same system, all to El Estero, and we treat that wastewater. So using our WEF manual of practice number 27, then we're able to go through a process to allocate costs between the various customer classes. And what it does is it avoids subsidies. So it tells us, is one customer class paying more or less of their fair share of the costs on the system? And really to meet the proportionality requirements of Proposition 218. What comes out of that is an overall adjustment by class, so the size of the pie for each customer class, as well as unit costs, which will ultimately become the rates for year 1. So as we go through the cost of service, the first year is essentially a reset or a true-up year, where we implement cost of service adjustments, and then years 2 and 3 are an across-the-board adjustment to rates. So the 5% would be increased in each year as part of that. So when we go through the cost of service, we look at fiscal year 2020. That's our first rate setting year. So we look at the projected cost for that year, and it reflects that overall 5% need. So the pie's increased, and so we allocate those costs to the different customer classes. Again, it's a 3-step process within the cost of service: functionalization, classification, and allocation. So functionalization is simply saying, what is it? It's the first 4 bullets that Malcolm had. It's collection, it's lift stations, it's treatment. So that takes place with the city's system of accounts. So you outline that, you budget in that manner. Then we classify costs. And so when we think about a wastewater study, really we have 2 components. We need to get the wastewater from point A to point B, B being El Estero, and we need to treat that. And that's really the driver and more of a focus of this rate study than you've had in the past, is looking at what is that treatment cost component. So when we classify costs, we classify them as volume related. So this is just moving the wastewater, or strength related. And for the city study, we're looking at biochemical oxygen demand, BOD, ammonia, or total suspended solids, TSS. And so again, as I mentioned, compared to prior studies that the city's completed, we're looking more at the treatment aspect of this and splitting this up. And that's driven by a couple things. It's driven by the discharge permit that the city has, making sure that you're meeting the requirements of the reuse water and how you're dealing with this going forward. And it also is starting to reflect the costs that you're incurring on the ammonia side to start taking the ammonia out of the waste stream as part of that. And so we're trying to capture that within this rate study. And then we have customer and capacity related, which is really a customer is an actual customer. We may allocate costs. We have this many residential versus this many non-residential. Postage is an easy example of that. Costs the same to mail a bill to any customer. And capacity demand is really looking at what is an equivalent method to allocate costs. So when we think about our collection system, it's moving wastewater from A to B. But there's also a sizing component of that. We need to size the system big enough to collect all of the wastewater from the entire system. So pipes are bigger to meet those demands. So this factor comes back and looks at equivalent demand component. So what is that equal to an equivalent dwelling unit component as far as that? So what we do is we go through each of the line items in the budget, operating and capital. So we take that revenue requirement and we classify it based on why we'd incurred the cost. So did we incur the cost to meet a volume need? Is it a strength need? Generally, it's multiple. So when we look at the treatment plant, there's a component for capacity. There's a component for each of the strength factors. So when we proportionally allocate this, then we come back and look at the total cost. So our total classification is on the bottom of this chart. It's the total cost, and as we've gone through the generally accepted methodologies and approach, we've classified $5.6 million to volume. And then we've classified essentially about another $5 million between our strength component, BOD, TSS, and ammonia. And then we have about $11 million of customer or capacity related costs. Now, how we allocate that is based on those percentages above. So when we look down the volume column, the first column with percentages, then it says residential 73%. Now what that's saying is that the residential customers contribute 73% of the volumes to the wastewater treatment plant. And so we've gone back, looked at historical water records, winter water use to determine what those total volumes are estimated to be. We don't meter wastewater, right? So we have to come back to winter water use, average use to come back and establish these and look at the planning documents and information the city has available. Commercial is 18%, commercial high/industrial is 8.9%, and high strength surcharge is 0%. And so as you look at this, of that $5.6 million, residential would be allocated 73% of that cost. And we do the same for each of our classification components. So what's interesting is, as we started looking at the strength factors on the system, is we started looking at comparing the volume to the BOD for residential. They're 73% of the volume, but they're only 64% of the BOD. Now that's because they have a lower strength than some of the other customers. So when you look at commercial and commercial high/industrial, they have a higher strength. So they receive a higher proportional share of that strength related cost. And that holds true across all of the strength components. Now, when we get to the high strength charge, then when we look at that, you'll see there's no cost allocated to volume, to weighted customer, or capacity demand. And as part of the study, we started looking at what should those customer classes be? Who should we be allocating cost to? And we try and put customers into groups that are very similar. And so as we started looking at this, the first place we went is to look at individual industrial rates, essentially. But your industrial customers vary so much. You could have a brewery, a winery, you could have all different types of customers, and they all have very different strength factors, and they can vary significantly. And so what we talked about and what we're proposing is that we capture all of our customers under a commercial high industrial or commercial rate. And then we have a high strength charge for those customers that exceed the limits that we've established for our domestic strength customer. So when we look at our BOD component and you see the 2% for high strength, what that's saying is that those are the proportion of pounds, we convert the BOD to pounds as part of this, that are over and above the strength limits that we've established. And so under this, it's 2% for BOD, it's 7.5 for TSS, and 3.9 for ammonia. So this is our proportional allocations of cost. So when I get down to the high strength rate discussion, then I'll talk a little bit more about how that plays into that discussion. But this is the basis for our allocation. What we do with that then is we sum up the costs that are allocated to each of the customer classes based on each of those classification components. And we compare that to our current revenues. And that tells us how do rates need to be adjusted. And so the 5% mark in the middle is the system average. So that's the size of our pie. Now, what this is saying is that to meet the 5% overall revenue adjustment, we would increase residential 2.4%, commercial 6.8%, and commercial high industrial 7.4%. What this is also showing is that with looking back at the strength components and looking at the costs that are incurred to meet overall strength levels, it's changed that cost of service from the prior cost of service. So commercial high industrial are receiving a more equitable share of the strength-related costs, and that is coming from the residential customers. So this is a little nuanced step that we need to make at this point in time, given some of the recent lawsuits over water and wastewater rates, where we need to reflect the overall cost of service. Whereas in the past, we could kind of look and the city council could make a policy determination on how we wanted to implement these costs.
Just wanted to clarify, this is a question I had when I read the staff report. So it's on page 14 of our big agenda packet. It says the increase of 5% is does not equate to a rate increases for 5%. So, for example, I'm quote here: a single-family residence with average water use will see an increase of 1.2% to its monthly wastewater bill. The average multifamily will be 2.5%. So that was just the averaging out, so that the commercial and then the high industrial would have a greater percentage to get to that 5%.
Correct, yes. So that 5% is the overall revenue need for the system. This now shows what the individual size of that pie is, or the revenue we need to collect from each customer class to meet the overall revenue, 5% revenue need. So the results do show minor cost differences, and these are minor. You've historically implemented cost of service rates, and these changes aren't significant from the 5% overall average. We usually give ourselves a couple percentage points on either side, just because we're looking at 1 year of cost. Things change, customer characteristics change. think of how your customer characteristics have changed over the years with the conservation, how water consumption has come down. That impacts the cost service analysis because that can impact wastewater flows. So that all drives how these cost service results can change over time. Ultimately, this reflects a proportional and equitable allocation of cost and supports the rates going forward. As we talked about, we have high strength charge unit costs that we'll look at, and this should be reviewed periodically so that you can capture any changes in your system. And as you know, looking across the country right now, we're seeing renewed focus on what those discharge limits are, and utilities are having to change their treatment process. That drives costs. So those customers that drive the cost should pay for those costs going forward. So now we know the overall size and the revenue needs. We know how we're going to, who we're collecting that from. Then we can determine how we're going to collect it. So we've developed the proposed rates based on the revenue requirement and cost of service results. For residential, we have 3 subclasses. The first is our single family. Right now, they have a cap of up to 10 HCF. HCF is 100 cubic feet. 100 cubic feet is 748 gallons. And so this allows for a maximum of 10 HCF for single family customers. That is based on what that typical residential customer uses and what goes to the El Estero. So based on the average characteristics, use over 10 HCF is outdoor use, so that's not impacting the sewer system as part of that. For multifamily, we are recommending adjustment to the consumption billing caps. Right now, 2 to 4 attached units for multifamily has a cap of 8. And when we started looking at their consumption characteristics, they're much more closely aligned with the single family customers. And so we're recommending that their cap goes up to 10, just like single family. So think of a duplex. A lot of times there's very, very similar characteristics as a single family home with number of people, yards, et cetera, that are there. On the 5+ attached units, those are your larger complexes. We are recommending no cap as part of that. And really the driver for that is looking at their characteristics. They generally have a separate irrigation meter. Their usage is generally much lower than the 2 to 4 units and single family units as part of that. And that overall wastewater contribution or water use is really coming back to the wastewater system as part of that. We also had multiple commercial classes in the past. We've combined those into commercial and commercial high/industrial. And so we had a commercial 1 through 3 with various customer groups in them. When you look at the characteristics, the strengths of those customers, they're all very similar in that commercial class. And so we've combined that. And then we have our high strength charge. So as we've gone through this, we've established strength levels based on the city's data and industry standards. And then anything in excess of that is charged the high strength charge. So for these commercial high and industrial customers, they're tested quarterly. And so based on that quarterly test, then they would incur a high strength charge for the pounds that go over those limits that we've established as part of the study. And it may not be all 3. It may only be one of those. It could be BOD, TSS, or ammonia. It may be all of them depending on the specific customer. So when we look at residential single family, then you can see the bill comparison. If you look at the present rate, it's $19.63 for that base monthly fee. And for 0 to 10 HCF, it's $3.41 per HCF. The proposed rate increases the base fee from $19.63 to $20.57, and it lowers the HCF charge, the water consumption charge component of the wastewater bill. Now, the reason for that is our cost of service unit costs. When we come back to those unit costs, we try and equitably and allocate and classify and allocate the cost based on why we incur that. And what this is showing is that that fixed charge should come up a little bit, and we can lower that variable component. And you can see that increases then over the next 2 years with the proposed rates as part of that. So the average customer bill, excuse me, you can look at somewhere between 4 and 8. There's a 78 cents to 62 cent change for the single family customer. Now, comparing it to some of the other local utilities, Goleta, Montecito, and Carpinteria, what's interesting here is those three all have a flat, fixed sewer rate. And so those are the current rates for fiscal year 19. And so that doesn't change regardless of the amount of water you use or the wastewater contribution. So this chart shows a 0 HCF, so somebody that uses no water, right around $20. And if we flip to somebody using 4 HCF, you can see that increases to about $35. And then as you jump to a large user under single family, the cap of 10 HCF, we're at about $55, which is right about where the other couple of these are as part of that. So really, customers are able to control their wastewater bill based on their water consumption use as part of this, whereas many other utilities don't have that ability. So that conservation incentive is still there under the wastewater rate component. For multifamily, then we have a base fee, again, same base charge per month. We have our 1 to 4 dwelling units and our 5+. Again, these are the same charges for all residential, single family, or multifamily, and the same changes as we saw for single family. So that impact is going to vary by customer depending on the size, number of units, and water use. For commercial, this is a minimum bill for these customers. So when you look at these, when these customers are billed, they take the greater of the minimum bill by meter size or the volume charge based on water consumption. And so if somebody uses essentially over 10 units, they'll be billed the volume component. If they use less than that, then they're going to be billed that minimum bill based on their meter size. So it's a mix of customers. It varies from month to month depending on the customer type, on whether they have the minimum bill or they're charged for all their volume component. Very customer impacts for these customers. Again, you can see that rate stays the same up till about 8 units, and that's based on that minimum bill for a 5/8 meter. And then as you get into the larger consumption levels, then you can see that bill increases once they go over that minimum bill. On the commercial high/industrial with a 1-inch meter, very similar rate structure as the commercial class, has a minimum bill plus a volumetric component. Again, until you get to about over 15 units for a 1-inch meter, then that bill stays the same, and then as you use more water, then those customers will have a higher increase.
Can I stop you now for a few questions? Going back to the residential, I notice you don't have any slides comparing our residential rate with our neighboring districts. Do you know how we compare?
Which districts?
And I'm talking about the multifamily.
Oh.
Goleta, Montecito, Carpinteria.
I don't have that right now, but that's something that we can put together and bring back.
Did you do a study of those districts?
I did not, no.
No, Mr. Chair, we don't have that available today, but we can produce that for you. Yeah. Typically, as our largest customer class, the single-family residential, this is a chart we bring for water and wastewater in our presentations. But certainly we can do that with their rate structure as well.
And can you go back to slide 23, please? The multifamily slide. I just want to clarify the notations here. So the 1963, that's the base rate. That's the fixed rate. That's the non-volumetric.
Correct.
And what is the volumetric? It's the same as single family.
Correct.
And that's 1963 per unit.
Yes.
So if it's a duplex, 2 units will each be paying 19.
That's correct.
And then the volume charge, so 0 to 8 would be 341. Is that per HCF?
Yes.
So if they're using 8 HCF, it's going to be roughly $25, $26 on top of the 19.
Correct.
So is that more or less than a single family payer for the same number of HCF?
It's going to be the same going forward.
The rate structure, Mr. Chair, for these 1 to 4 unit multifamily developments and single family are on parity. So in FY20, they would have the same rate right through to 10 HCF.
So my concern there is it seems like, at least from experience in my district and other places I've seen in the city, if you have 4 units, particularly now with the AUD, which is eliminated in some cases, almost all watering or any kind of outdoor use, it's disproportionately charging these multifamily uses. And I don't know how many units within the city would fall into that category. I'm sure it's a spectrum, but I am concerned that the caps might be or should be different.
Mr. Chair, if I may respond, we looked, and unfortunately we don't have it here today, but we have a scatter plot of different water uses for these 1 to 4 units and then a 5+, and there's a very clear difference in the average. But I should let you know that less than, I think, 3%, maybe 1 to 2% of our multifamily developments will be affected at all by these changes. That most multifamily developments, whether large or small, are below these maximums.
Okay, so the caps are significantly higher
Right.
than what we're seeing.
There are some developments we have to go through. I think there's roughly about 1,000 accounts to go through, and we'll identify those that are potentially most impacted and reach out to them, because there are typically things they can do, which is look at an irrigation meter, replace their fixtures with more water efficient fixtures, and help them before these go into effect.
Mr. Hagmark, did you want to comment?
Yeah, Mr. Chair. When we looked at this, the average of our multifamily are using about 4 HCF a month. Again, they don't have the outdoor watering, and so we expect their bills, their wastewater bills, to be substantially less than most residential where you have outdoor watering. And so that's why that variation. But we looked at it even seasonally, and that's usually an indicator of the outdoor watering. It's kind of tough here because some winters we have to irrigate throughout the winter because we get so little rainfall. But in general, if we looked at multi-years, we were noticing that the winter and summer demands for our multifamily, particularly our 5 and over, was basically the same, which tells us that it's really indoor water usage. And so I would expect our multifamily are somewhere, the 90% of them are somewhere in the 4 HCF.
Correct.
And a quick aside, I think yesterday one weather station said that we had a record high yesterday. Did anyone else hear that? Another one said it tied 87. So who knows what that portends for next winter. And the other question, and this pertains to both multifamily and single family, are we giving any kind of benefit to families or households that have implemented like low flow toilets, gray water systems, or anything else that reduces water consumption?
Mr. Chair, I'm not aware of anything particularly credit-wise, but we had looked at the beginning of this rate study of moving to a more fixed charge approach. So I'm raising our fixed charge to about 80%, 80-20 with volumetric. What we found, though, is that it didn't, as we showed in those charts, it doesn't allow customers to manage their bill as well. So we find that we're going to stick with the 50% fixed charge, 50% volumetric. And that way, when they do reduce their water use, they will reduce their water bill as well as their wastewater bill.
And I was going to comment on that later in the comments, but I'll bring it up now. I'm glad to hear that the other districts are completely ignoring volumetric or keeping it fixed, and that we're not, because, you know, I've pushed in the past, particularly with our water systems, to increase the volumetric aspects. So I'm glad we're at least holding the line there, if not moving more in the direction I'd like. So thank you for answering those questions.
So on high strength, then as I talked about, when we allocated costs, remember back to the cost service table, we're only allocating treatment related strength costs to the high strength charge. And so it's based on an average cost per pound, and so we're able to equate the cost to a per pound basis. And what we do know is we know the total pounds removed at the plant. And we also know the typical strength characteristics of our customers just based on industry data, averages at the plant. And so what we've done is we've looked at the total pounds at the plant, what we collect, what our pounds would be under the maximums for our current rate schedules, which in this case is 750 milligrams per liter for BOD, 850 milligrams per liter per TSS, and 90 milligrams per liter for ammonia. And that difference is the high strength pounds that need to be collected through this charge. So when we went back through and you look at the total costs allocated to BOD, TSS, and ammonia, Then we divide that through by those additional pounds over and above those limits. And what that results in is a rate for BOD of 28 cents per pound, 38 cents per pound for TSS, and 89 cents per pound for ammonia. And so this applies to all customers in that commercial high industrial component. And when they're tested, it'll show up as part of that. And it'll also apply to some of those others. So a brewery may discharge a bad batch into the system. And so city staff has been working with them to look at how they can maybe mitigate that. And if they cannot mitigate that and they do dump a whole batch, then these types of charges would apply to them as well. And so it's tied back to the overall strength costs.
Thank you. I'm learning so much. I appreciate it. Never thought I'd be learning about this. So is this the same as the high-strength surcharge?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And I'm noting here we have a note on one of the earlier slides that the release of the final, this is contingent on the release of the final report, or it's going back to Water Commission. Can you talk about the status of that report and why we don't have it yet, when we can expect it, what that's going to do to these numbers?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Harmon. Yes, so the rate-making process for water and wastewater is rather challenging. And as you've kind of gotten full immersion into the budget process, staff have been working pretty aggressively to put together our budgets for the next 2 years. And so we've just finished that up in February. Putting that together, again, it's still making its way to you all. But we started this whole rate process last summer, and so we've been putting everything together. We now have all the final information to put into the rate model. The rate model is done, and Sean and his staff are now compiling the report. So the report reflects the outcomes of the model and how the data came together. And so they're working on that. We expect that shortly, and then we run it through our city attorney's office for final review, and then we make that available to the public probably in the first part of May. State law requires that that report be out 15 days prior to the public hearing. The public hearing for this is June 11th. And so this whole process is complicated, but the intent is that this mailing that hopefully we get approval for today would go out roughly at the end of April. In early May, we'll have the memo or the report, the study done, fully available and transparent to the public, that they can review that and bring their concerns forward to the hearing in which the council will hear that.
I appreciate that. I have to assume, with how complicated this seems to me, that the earlier that information can get out to folks, the better. I imagine there are a lot of people that are probably quite excited to see it, myself included. I still don't quite understand, and this is on, I guess, the third slide, requested that staff return after release of final report with further discussion on high-strength surcharges. Who's going to be having that discussion? What does that mean for what we're voting on today, if anything at all?
The Water Commission opened the door for us to come back and just have a discussion once the report was made publicly available. But it didn't change their decision that they were ready to move forward with the proposed rates. I should say that the rates, as we're noticing them, they are the highest that the council can adopt. The council can choose, following the public hearing, to adopt something less than that. The repercussions of delaying this process is we could end up adopting a budget in which we do not have a rate structure for, and that sets off a whole nother problematic timeline. So the Water Commission, I think, wanted to just have a fully vetted discussion on it. With that, we have done our best to provide, at least to Moorburg Industries, as much information as we can at this point without having our attorneys go through it. But we're trying to explain how we arrived at this process, including how we've also looked at what other agencies are charging, because we are a unique agency in that we take high strength. A lot of agencies, our neighbors, Goleta doesn't take it. Oxnard doesn't take it. Hill Canyon doesn't take it. A lot of the neighboring wastewater agencies do not take this high-strength waste. They basically say, you need to pre-treat it and bring it down to a threshold in which we will accept it. And so we are somewhat unique in that, but when we did a comparison, which we have right here, we did look around to make sure that what we were talking about moving towards isn't something out of alignment with what other agencies are looking at. But we are somewhat unique. Goleta doesn't even look at this stuff.
And this comparison is just information here of what different folks do. It varies by entity if they accept it, as Joshua stated, as well as the facilities that are available for folks to dump at. And so this is, as part of this, when I said we were looking at individual industrial rates, septage hauler rates were a specific class we were looking at prior to recommending the high strength charge approach. And so this was a comparison that we had put together, and the green bar on the far left is the current rate. The yellow is the average calculated rate for the high strength surcharge component, which is just below 5 cents. And then we had looked at various different agencies that had septage hauler rates specifically. And so this just looks at what that looks like. As Joshua stated, we were just looking at a comparison. Again, these are hard. Any rate comparison may or may not be an apples to apples comparison because we don't always know exactly what folks do. Santa Maria is one we do know they take it. They have facilities in place to deal with that. And so you can see their rate reflects that overall cost that they have as part of that.
So the 28 cents, 38 cents, do you have comparisons from other districts for those pound rates?
I do. It's something we hadn't put together, but it's something we could put together. Again, it's very unique depending on the cost driver. So I've worked with utilities that are also having ammonia improvements, and they were in about the same range, but it's something that we can put together for the council to look at or provide back to the committee.
Mr. Hagmark?
Mr. Chair. Yeah, and some of these agencies, also to be clear too, have actual septic dumping stations at their plant. We don't have the space to accommodate that, and so there is some certainly cost associated with that. In our case, we're receiving this through the sewer system, and so we do not have a on-site collection system to take that type of high-strength waste. And so some of these costs, I mean, I'm just kind of understanding why some of these costs vary and why we are on the low side potentially compared to some of these. We just don't have that on-site facility.
So these septage hauler rates, I'm not sure who to ask, this is where the hauler is just dumping it untreated at their plant, Santa Maria? Someone's just dump trucking or piping it out of a truck directly into a tank, or
into the system. It just depends on the specifics. But yes, they're backing up the truck and they're offloading that truck into a facility at the treatment plant generally.
The raw product.
Correct.
And
yes.
And Mr. Hagmark, you're saying in our system it's dumped into the sewer. Is it dumped in treated or untreated?
The way that, in particular, Marburg Industry does it, they have tanks on site, and so they do some screening of large material, and then they have a mixing system in which it's then just pumped out of those tanks and into it's about a block away, pumped into the city's collection system, and it goes to El Estero.
Treated or untreated?
Untreated.
Okay. And like the example of a bad batch of beer, which strikes me as wrong for a number of reasons, is that dumped and treated into the system?
Correct.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, they should be notifying us, and it's important to note that these high-strength surcharges are not just applicable to our industrial users, although it most likely will be them. It's possible like a commercial high user, like these breweries, would have a bad batch, notify us, we'd sample, and then we'd charge them based on their constituent limits.
Yeah, wineries, distilleries, and breweries are another potential. The other ones that would be a candidate, too, is laundry facilities, but we have some pretty progressive laundry facilities in town that do a lot of recycling on site and so they do a lot of pretreatment. And so what they discharge would be under, at least as far as what we've seen so far, would be underneath the thresholds that we've set here. So kudos to them for making that pretreatment investment.
Great. Mr. Friedman, did you have a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on these. Mr. Hagmark, you mentioned that with the septic going, it's treated into tanks and the solids are pulled out and then it goes into our system. Is that correct?
No, it's just as I understand it, and maybe Derek can speak to that. They screen it. I think they take out any large rocks, rags, things that get sucked up in their septic tank. pumping, they will screen that out. But this is high strength stuff. I mean, we're talking stuff that's at least 10, on the order of 10 times what you'd see from a normal residential home.
Okay, so it's just the large solids that are screened out, but then the rest is put in the system.
I would say large non-organic. So the organic material is coming to us. So,
Thank you.
Yeah, foreign objects.
So to summarize, next steps here. Did you want to do? You want me to?
Sure, I can finish it out. Thank you, Mr. Gorn. Today, you received the presentation. We're looking for a recommendation to notice to our customers. The Proposition 218 notice, as Mr. Hagmark mentioned, these are the maximum rates that can be adopted at the public hearing on June 11th. There's a 45-day noticing period, and we would be planning to send these notices out next week, so we'd be able to clear that 45-day noticing period with about 10 days of wiggle room. And our final consultant report, we're aiming to have ready in about the middle of May to make available to the public. And we'll do that as soon as it's passed through our legal review in the city. And that's the end of our presentation. Any questions you may have?
When is the department's budget hearing?
May 29th for Public Works.
So you anticipate the report will be generated a few weeks before that?
That's correct. At least a couple weeks before that, and we'd like to have it out before we go back to the Water Commission as they requested.
Okay. And going back to the slide in the beginning, let's see, I guess it's the first substantive slide, 95 million in capital needs over the next 25 years. So how much of this report, how much of that $95 million is taken into account in the revenue requirements? I guess that would be slide 9. And I guess it would be in... Well, it wouldn't be in the net debt service because that's a backwards-looking number, and the rate-funded capital, those are for current projects, and then the O&M is obviously for existing structures. So is any of that $95 million part of these next 5 years?
Mr. Chair, a small amount of it is. So the electrical renewal project, which is estimated at about $18 million, will be completed just outside this rate study period. So about 2024, 25 is when it will be completed. However, what is included in this rate study is as we draw down on the SRF loan that we anticipate getting, we will be paying interest on those drawdowns, and those are incorporated in here. There is also debt service associated with our secondary aeration project, and that's included in here as well as fully amortized debt.
Can you say that one more time, please?
The aeration project is included in here. It was a large project of about $32 million. That is fully incorporated into the rates that we're proposing. And then there's a small amount of interest expenses included for the electrical renewal project. But for the most part, the electrical renewal project will be complete after this rate study period, and then it will be amortized, and the full principal and interest payment will go into effect.
And that's the jump you see in 2021 in the green for the debt service are the two projects that Malcolm was just mentioning.
I would also like to note that a portion of this contract with HER is to produce a 10-year financial plan for us, and we'll have that available in the report as well. And that will take a look, of course, 10 years out at what kind of rate increases, revenue increases you'll need to meet these demands, some of which are going to be SRF funded from the facility plan and some of which are going to be PAYGO capital funded.
So, Mr. Chair, what we tried to do in the master plan that looked out 30 years was to try and, recognizing that we're likely to do these large capital projects with these state revolving fund loans, was to try and spread it out so that that debt service remains relatively consistent so that we wouldn't have these large swings and jumps in our rates. And so as we pay off one significant capital project, will then take on another. And so that was the idea here. And when we came up with this, it was somewhere in about $5 million a year of debt service that we felt was manageable and would also help, would also allow us to meet our capital investment needs that we had. So it was a really helpful document, and I think it's really, we're trying to be able to allow the public to see a nice, predictable, expected investment here. The other point that I know we didn't make here today is that when we're talking about a 5% revenue, we also need to remind everybody that about 2.5% of that is eaten up by just inflation. The cost of consultant services, materials. So when we talk about a 5% revenue increase, it really boils down to about 2.5% as we continue, as the value of what work we need to get done costs more. And so I think that's what's challenging, and we've seen it, unfortunately, with a lot of smaller agencies who were afraid of making those annual rate increases, got behind, and then all of a sudden they need to do 30, 40% rate increases because they didn't keep up with it, and they now are finding themselves behind the 8 ball and can't maintain the critical infrastructure that they need. And so as painful as these discussions are on an annual basis, making these incremental increases really keeps us, I think, up to pace and making those investments that we need to make.
So what would be helpful to me is a chart, kind of like the timeline on slide 9, but maybe that has each capital project, the lifespan of the project, the financing. Obviously I'd like the financing to be shorter than the lifespan of the project when possible. But then how much beyond that? So is there going to be a year where we actually aren't spending any money on improvements because we've got a whole bunch of stuff done, and then it's just the 2.5 or whatever the CPI will be? So I'd like to see that, over the next 10 years and maybe the last 10 years, just to kind of do a historical comparison. And I know, it varies during recessions and non-recession periods, but it would be nice to see maybe that 20-year outlook with the major, the $32 million. Did you say it was the aeration, or was that the phase 2?
Excuse me, Mr. Chair, that's been completed. Let me skip to some backup slides here, and maybe just to give you a visual of what we're talking about.
We also could share with you that
Yeah.
facilities master plan. I mean, I think that kind of lays it out, and it shows how we're kind of thinking about it. And again, we'll adjust. We have, economic downturns and other things that we need to adjust to, droughts, things like that. We certainly will make adjustments, but the plan is to try and make these evenly distributed investments in our system. So,
And did that make sense, what I meant in terms of the timeline? Maybe you have a green line for the electrical and a red line below that for the aeration, showing kind of their start date, their end date. Maybe in the middle of the block you can put the financing and its timeline, maybe just in a black line.
Certainly, Mr. Chair. We have this table here as well, and this is more of the tabular form of what that facilities plan looks like and what those capital projects are. You notice the funding source is either SRF loan, which is long-term financing, or the Elistero wastewater treatment plant capital funds, but that means PAYGO capital, rate-funded capital. And so this is what we're looking at. It's just a plan, but certainly we can bring something back that's a little more detailed in terms of useful life of the project, start and finish dates.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? Okay, we'll go ahead and open it up for public comment. Is there any public comment? Please make sure the mic is turned on. You should have a nice bright green LED light there.
We're good.
there you go.
Greener. Thank you. My name is Derek Carlson. I'm the business manager of Marburg Industries, and Marburg would like to make a couple of comments on the report made to the Finance Committee today and the impact that the proposed wastewater rate change is going to have. So the wastewater rate change as presented is going to have a 700% increase to Marburg Industries in its disposal costs. Now, that in and of itself has caused us a lot of concern as a business. But what has been equally concerning to us is that the report hasn't been released for us to review that we are basing this enormous increase on. Unfortunately, it wasn't available when we met with the Water Commission to have this original discussion a few weeks ago. It's still not available as we're moving on to the Finance Committee. And, it sounds like it will not be available until, pretty quickly before the City Council hearing, which, as was testified today by Mr. Korn, this took a long time. Been working a year on this, and to have a couple of weeks to look at it seems inappropriate when the consequence is a 700% increase to our company. Especially when we hear words like it's using industry averages, and we're using calculations, and then we're going to tailor it to the city conditions on the street. And to us, using big averages like that is something that we would like to look at and really see if it is tailored to what's going on the ground in the city of Santa Barbara. And that part has caused us concern if we've seen some of the slides and commented at the Water Commission and has been addressed here a little bit. But in looking at the comparative rates, what was not taken into account there was the investment that Marburg has made in the infrastructure, trying to build a collaborative effort in disposing of this waste component of our business. And so we have developed the disposal station there and have worked with the Air Board to do all of the odor reduction requirements. We have done pre-processing there where we screen the material, and we do get the foreign objects and also some of the solids, organic solids out of the material as well that we have to haul off separately. We also pre-treat our material also with fluorous chloride, which helps neutralize the portable restroom deodorizers that get used. And in addition, we have put in the large underground storage tanks where we aerate and agitate the material. We have a computerized electronic system that meters our waste into the sewer system so it reaches a preferred dilution level. So all of those things we do and are not in that comparative chart when you're looking at Santa Maria, for example. Another thing that isn't considered is another requirement that was made of Marburg is Marburg also has a separate disposal station that we provide free dumping for all of the RVs in town. Whether they are used for dwellings or whether they are for vacationers or whether they are used for the food services businesses that have the mobile businesses in town. All of those come and use our facility free of charge to prevent illegal dumping, to prevent dumping in creeks and the streets and all of the stuff that we have suffered in the past. And so, as a result of the huge increase, not having access to the report, and a doubt as to whether all of the on-the-ground City of Santa Barbara characteristic tailoring has been put into the numbers that were presented today, we asked the Wastewater Commission that they not approve Table 5, which is the high-strength rate portion. And we find ourselves very far along a path where wastewater rates are being brought to the City Council for approval, where we probably will not have much option or much time to review the report when it comes out. So, today I asked to bring a compromise that we may build something from here where we have the time to look at the report, we have the time to put into place any necessary measures that may be done to further pre-treat material or address how much of the tailoring to the city was actually done. And so what Marburg would like to propose is that a high-strength surcharge be put on the books so that rate structure is there. A high-strength surcharge be put in the amount where Marburg would see a 200% rate increase. That we feel is fair dealing with the city in increasing our rates, recognizing the need and desire to set rates based on strength, and also allows us the opportunity to verify that those calculations are correct and appropriate for our situation. We think that a compromise of that sort, where we look at a more limited increase until we have access to view and vet the report, is a reasonable request and would also add a level of fairness and transparency to the overall process. So that is our request today.
So I do have a question. So in terms of your proposal to do a 200% increase, how would that manifest itself in these pound rates, the BOD, TSS, and ammonium? I'm guessing that's a percentage cost of your, so is there a way to translate that into pound rates?
Roughly translating it, it would be multiplying those numbers by 25%.
Okay.
So right now our regular industrial meter permit or metering permit is going up 11%. And by multiplying those numbers by 25%, It would increase our rates the other 190% to get us to about that number. And I'm sure your consultant can help with that, but that is about what will get to that number.
Okay. Any other questions? Thank you. Any other public comment? Seeing none, we'll close public comment. So I wanted to follow up on that proposal. Would reducing these pound surcharges by 75 cents down to 25% of their current totals, what would be the impact?
Essentially, the city wouldn't collect that piece of the revenue because we can't shift that based on Prop 218 back to other customers. And so then the utility would be foregoing that amount of revenue. The total revenue that we're calculating at this point in time for the high strength charge is just below $300,000. And so we would not collect 75% of that theoretically as part of that.
And would Prop 218 allow you to charge, I'm concerned about the existing investment that they've made. Would it allow you to charge future customers? Because I'm thinking what seems more equitable is to charge people who haven't invested in the city but might invest in the future to do full cost recovery for those future businesses so that they come in and know what the prices will be.
It starts a slippery rate setting approach and legal approach. I don't have a legal response on that. Generally, we're allocating costs around the characteristics of the class of service. And so for the high strength, we're allocating it based on those pounds that are generated over and above the limits. And so I'm not sure. It could be a city policy to do something like that, but I think that'd be vetted through legal to make sure that that's an acceptable process. We can't move costs under Prop 218 away from one customer to another customer. That's the primary issue there.
Right. You can create categories with a certain amount of discretion, but in terms of pushing it outside it once you've created those categories.
Correct.
Mr. Chair, we would, if we were to put that on pause and then we would go back to legal review with the city attorney's office and potentially delay adoption to look at our options. So the wastewater fund right now, as we mentioned, has capital needs. Our reserves are at about council policy or just slightly above. So we would want to take that into account and look at what the impacts would be if we were to dip below slightly in FY20 or 21 as we kind of put these on hold, these increases. Mr. Hagmark.
Mr. Hagmark?
Sure, it's a very unfavorable idea, but the other solution is using general fund money to subsidize that rate if that's what the council wants to do. I think that we do get into a challenge with Prop 218 in not collecting the cost of service, and so I think we'd have to engage Mr. Colon and Mr. Henske in our attorney's office on that, but that would be a solution that would be in compliance with Prop 218.
So a separate but slightly unrelated question. Do we charge a catch-up fee for any customers who join the system? So if there's an undeveloped parcel of land unimproved and they want to contribute sewage to the system, is there anything beyond ongoing fees that we collect?
Yes, Mr. Chair, we have capacity charges, which is it's a buy-in approach. That's what it's termed. And if you join the system, you essentially bring yourself up to speed with everyone else by making a buy-in fee. And then you are on equity with all the current customers, and you can pay the current rates.
What is the buy-in fee for residential?
Mr. Chair, I don't know off the top of my head. We can look it up quickly. Dana Hoffenberg's here. She works with our customers. And what that does take into account is it's our replacement cost for our assets, so what everyone is paid up to already, and then less your depreciation value. And you pay in at that rate on a unit basis. So however much capacity you want on your lateral side, based on the meter size, then you'd pay in at that on a unit basis. So so when you come into the system, you have to get yourself up to speed.
And so would someone who was doing the septage hauling, would they be subject to those capacity charges?
If they wanted to install a new meter, yes, they almost certainly would. But there are some special cases, and we do have in our fee resolutions the authority for our public works director to use their discretion, because these rates, of course, there are special cases that you have to take into account.
So right now, that buy-in fee for wastewater alone for a single-family residential home is $3,600 for wastewater, and then on top of that, they have $9,000 that they'd pay to buy into the city's water system. Now that there's multifamily is a little different. I don't know if you remember the discussion we talked about fixture units. So you gets into, and depending, we kind of structured it in a way that if you have a very small unit with a very few fixture units, you can only generate so much waste. Your buy-in fees would be much less. So it kind of speaks to the ADU small unit dwelling units that are out there.
And what about the buy-in for a commercial facility? So for a brewery, for example.
So it's based on meter size. So let's just say that a brewery, for whatever reason, needed a 2-inch meter. Their buy-in would, for wastewater, would be about $30,000.
And that's agnostic as to whether they'll be producing high-strength waste or not.
Correct.
So is there a way there we can adjust the fees under Prop 218?
So the capacity charges are not part of Prop 218. It's a separate approach to establishing the rates, and California Government Code 66,000 outlines that approach. There are folks that do implement capacity charges with a strength component built in there. So they may have the $3,600 for a single family. That's kind of across the board for those customers. And then when you get to the commercial or high strength, it is weighted more based on the strength. Similar to what we looked at here with the strength charges. It's a similar approach where we break down that buy-in component based on the facilities that are needed to meet that strength capacity. And that's really what that's looking at, is we only have a certain amount of capacity in certain components of the plant to meet those strength needs. And so they get a higher share of that. So that is a method that can be used.
Mr. Chair, if I may add that, correct me if I'm wrong, Sean, that these are treatment cost related. So
correct.
So if the high strength surcharges or those strength loadings are reduced, our treatment costs will be reduced in the same year. So they aren't necessarily contributing more to the infrastructure investment as they rise with the treatment cost with the strength discharges. So if they were able to pre-treat down, if somebody's using a high strength surcharge and they pre-treat down, on the other side of the balance sheet, our operating costs would go down for treatment in the same year.
All right. I think I'm generally supportive of the staff recommendation. I want to appreciate all the work that went into this. And today's, just rereading what the staff recommendation is to send a notice of public hearing to customers, informing them of the public hearing and changes to wastewater. I'm prepared to move that forward today, but I do think that Mr. Carlson raises some valid and reasonable issues related to Marburg and any pre-treatment or pre-screening. That pre-screening is probably a little better than pre-treatment, but that they've done any infrastructure that they've placed. So I'd like to move the staff recommendation, and help me out if we can do this, but also give some direction to staff to engage with Marburg on any possibility or the feasibility of maybe phasing in over a year or two, and see if there is an opportunity. You kind of just hit where I was going, to see if there is an opportunity for them over the next year to do enhanced pre-treating, which would then reduce our costs over that. So if we had that extra year or so for them to do that, but I don't want to make that motion here. I'd rather give direction for you to work with Marburg on the compromise that was proposed out there, and have you work that out rather than just give you a specific 200% right now or whatever that is. So, one, move the recommendation and then give you that separate direction today to work with them on a potential phase-in. I guess I'll make that motion.
Do we have a second? If not, I can maybe suggest something, see if the maker of the motion is willing, because I'm not sure in terms of logistics how that would play out and what exactly would check that box to make sure that's accomplished, but something more black and white is ask staff to bring to council when they bring the staff recommendation. Also, an alternative that does do a 200% or whatever that translates into the pound surcharge for the next 2-year budget cycle. So that way council has the two concrete options in front of it, and that way you can get whatever legal work you need done from the city attorney if that's the way the council goes, so we don't have to push it back.
Mr. Chair, would you also like us to explore the use of general fund money to make up that shortage?
If that ends up being part of the system. One of the things I'm concerned about is if this does cause the price of these septic uses to go up, that people will fall out of the system. In other words, they won't use porta potties when they need to, and that'll end up having a detrimental aspect to the environment and obviously to our quality of life. People may dump their beer directly into a creek bed or system. So I want to avoid a situation where these spikes may cause people to become bad actors. So having a phase-in plan is kind of what I'm looking for. So whatever feasible means to achieve those goals would be, I think, perfectly welcome at council to make a final decision, informed final decision.
I think would be helpful, and I think Water Commission was looking for this too. And I understand Marburg's concerns about propriety over their costs, but what do they charge? I mean, what does a porta potty cost, and how much of it is related to disposal of the waste? I mean, that's something we still don't know on our end, and I think it would be helpful for the public discussion, particularly if we're talking about using general fund money for the reasons that you just mentioned. What is that difference? So it's going up by 700%, because right now they're paying very little for the disposal of this high strength waste. It's going to go up, but is that, does that equate to $2 for every porta potty that's deployed, or is that, much more significant compared to the overall cost of renting a porta potty? We just don't have any of those numbers. We've talked to them about it, and they, for confidentiality reasons, they do not want to share it because that potentially their competitors would get that. So I don't know how exactly to have that conversation, but I think that's the point that you're getting at, is really at the end of the day, how much does this really change the dynamics? I do know in our conversations that because we are such right now, a very low-cost place to dispose of, Marburg is collecting waste in Oxnard and Ventura and Lompoc and bringing it here for disposal. And so it's not just city septic and porta potty usage. We're talking about a much more regional collection. And given that there is very few players in that industry of disposal, I understand why they've kind of created a market around Santa Barbara.
If I may add also, Mr. Chair, we were speaking to Simi Valley this morning. They have manifest required, was it in-city or out-of-city? They only allow in-city. And there is some general benefit to discouraging the improper dumping and discharge of wastewater. So certainly if we had a better handle on where the waste was coming from, we may be able to provide a more defensible rate that's lower, where there's this general benefit cost spread to the other rate classes.
And we've asked for that information, but...
And I agree, the regionalism is great. So to the extent that the lower rate would encourage regionalism, people in Nolita, that aren't represented by a city government, it's great to, I think, have one collector that works with one entity so that we can increase, because part of what their funds go to is to pay capital expenses, but also staff expenses, and there's an economy of scale. Rather than having 20 wastewater facilities sprinkled along the South Coast, it's great to have fewer that are able to afford the most frequent environmental upgrades. So to the extent we can kind of capture that money here and improve our plant as often as we are doing a $32 million, electrical improvement, $95 million in upcoming costs, similar to what we're doing with our desal plant. We don't want 10 desal plants along the South Coast, so I think that does improve that. Do you want to? Okay.
Yeah, because I'm
Okay.
a little confused over what your motion is, so if you wanted to craft a motion, Councilman Dominguez.
My motion would be to recommend that staff send the Prop 218 notice and bring to council the rate recommendations, including an alternative that would meet the proposal that Mr. Carlson recommended. And again, noting that they brought a proposal to work with us. They didn't come with a positional bargaining of, we're not going to accept any rate increase, but they're willing to sit down with us. So I think that's very admirable. So that would be my motion.
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
So it passes unanimously. Thank you very much. Meeting adjourned.